Fourth. Hello, my name is Dr. Jackalyn Rainosek, and I am with DTP Leadership Group. And this is Hot Topic Bold Talk. I have the privilege of having Richard Wilson on with me monthly, which I'm so glad because he is going to describe the legal aspects to a very interesting case, Trump versus Illinois. What I think is fascinating about it is you as listeners are going to have a chance to fully understand what the legal issues are that prevent Trump from taking some actions. And I'll leave it at that because I think Richard has the best story. So, Richard, I'm going to turn it over to you. And then if I interrupt you and ask a question, then you'll understand. Okay?
Okay. Um, and what we're discussing today is an order that was entered by the United States Supreme Court in December in the pending case Trump v. Illinois. And the what happened was the court entered an order, so it's not like a normal opinion where you have the justices signing on in different places. The order that has effect, we have no idea who wrote it. And this is part of what Supreme Court practitioners refer to as the shadow docket. And what I mean by that is the orders that the court issues without reaching a formal opinion, often which happen while a case is pending, and that is what happened here, are such that they can have a very substantial legal effect despite the fact that the order may simply be a sentence or two. Now, with Trump v. Illinois, we don't have that. We have um, four different opinions. It covers 25 pages and it deals specifically with the actions of President Trump to call up the Illinois National Guard and the Texas National Guard to assist immigrations and customs enforcement officers with their efforts to enforce the law in Chicago, Illinois. This was the immigration crackdown we had before what has recently happened in Minneapolis. And the White House relied on a statute that exists, a federal law that allows the president to use the National Guard when he is unable with regular forces to execute the laws of the United States. The president relied on that statute and mobilized the National Guard, intending to send the National Guard into Chicago to assist immigrations and customs enforcement. And the order by the court, which is a preliminary order and which was really only 2 pages long, the order that has effect was very brief. What the court said is regular forces in this statute means the Army. It doesn't mean any and all federal employees. And because immigrations and customs enforcement personnel were not part of the regular military, I said the Army, but I mean the regular military, that the president could not send the National Guard into Chicago to aid them in enforcing the laws at this time. Um, Now, some of the questions that people may have are, okay, well, if the president can use the regular military to do this, then why just use the National Guard instead? And one of the reasons behind that, I'm not going to claim that I can crawl into that man's head and tell you what he's thinking. But one of the practical reasons why one might attempt to use the National Guard as opposed to the Army or the Marines is an existing federal criminal law. You've probably heard the term on the news, but the name of the law is Posse Comitatus. It is a criminal statute, 18 U.S.C. 1385. And what that statute provides is that it is a crime to use the military, and it specifically reads the Army, the Navy, the Marine Corps, the Air Force, or Space Force as a posse comitatus to execute the laws of the United States unless expressly authorized by the Constitution or an act of Congress. Essentially, it makes it illegal to mobilize the military and use them as a posse to enforce the laws in the United States unless there is a statute that allows you to do so. So by mobilizing the National Guard to attempt to do this, presumably the intention was to avoid that criminal statute because that criminal statute doesn't apply to the National Guard. It only applies to the Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, and Space Force.
Okay, let me pause here for a minute and just ask a question before we go on, because I think you're going to get into the detail of it, and I want to be sure I ask this question. My understanding is the governor of a state calls out the National Guard. Only the governor. This has happened in California. It's happened in Oregon. It's happened. It was in Illinois. It was being threatened, and it certainly created a horrific mess in Minneapolis. So what I don't understand is, okay, we have a criminal law that you've just talked about. You can't get a posse of our Army or Marines to come in and take over. Yet that's what happened in California. Military came in and it created a horrific mess. So for a moment, and you may be going to be talking about this in your discussion with this case, so I don't want to interrupt you there. But it seems to me that it's almost like it's a minimization of governors of Democratic states because that's where it's all happening. So I think there is a political thing that comes behind it. Now, we don't have to talk about the political thing that's going behind it, or you can make some comments about it if you want to. But I do think we need to understand the whole legal aspects so we can understand. Because to me, the only way he could bring in the military is for the Congress to approve it. And there has been no talk with the Congress, been no action. So I'm gonna put that all out there and I'll leave you to make your intelligent legal comments so that we can have a better, all of us can have a better understanding that are listening to this podcast.
Well, I don't know that the comments will be intelligent, but nonetheless, I'll give it a shot. First off, with regard to your question about only the governors of particular states can activate their National Guard, there are federal laws on the books that allow the federal government to activate the National Guard and to call Guard troops into active service. More often, you would see it in a circumstance where uh, the country is at war and Guard troops might be called up to assist the regular military, uh, with the war in Iraq or the war in Afghanistan when those were taking place. So the president can call up the National Guard. Typically, the Guard is called up by the governors of the states, and typically that's the way it is done. If you were to look at the statute I was talking about earlier, it refers to the governors of the states or the District of Columbia in that case, acting through them to call up the National Guard. So you've got that factor. The second thing is in relation to the regular military and using the regular military, there are statutes, and we will get to those as we move further in
Okay.
the discussion, that would allow the president to use the regular military in some circumstances. And this is another term that many of your listeners may have heard used recently. I know the president has bandied the phrase about the statute or group of statutes is referred to as the Insurrection Act, which
Right.
allows the president to call the military up under certain circumstances. And the last case I can think of where that happened, it arguably predates some of your listeners, was in 1992, I believe, during the Rodney King riots. That when that was happening, you had circumstances where, as I understand it, the LA Sheriff's and Police Department were afraid to go into South Central LA, and you had active military that was used to enforce the law there in that limited circumstance. But I will tell you that it is the Insurrection Act in particular is rarely used.
Right.
Now, with Trump v. Illinois, they, and again, the the opinion that the majority of the justices joined into goes into the fact that 300 members of the Illinois National Guard were called into active federal service, and were the intent was to bring them to Chicago to assist Immigration and Customs Enforcement with executing the laws of the United States. The Texas National Guard was also federalized. And what happened there was Illinois said, we want to keep the president from doing this. And the district court agreed with the state of Illinois. The Seventh Circuit also agreed with the state of Illinois and the district court and said that the district court stayed the president from sending the National Guard into Chicago. The Seventh Circuit affirmed that decision by the district court in large part. And then the government petitioned the Supreme Court to see if the Supreme Court would weigh in on this and lift the stay, lift the injunction entered by the district court. And while we won't get into it in great detail, there have been cases since Trump came into office in 2025 where the Supreme Court has greatly curtailed the ability of district courts to use injunctions to prevent the federal government from performing certain actions. Now, what happened here is the Supreme Court asked the parties, what does the term regular forces mean in that particular statute? The government was arguing regular forces included immigrations and customs enforcement. And after being asked to brief the issue, the state really for the first time at the Supreme Court says, well, regular forces only means the United States military. And that's what the Supreme Court said that they believe the statute means, or the majority of the justices said that they believe the statute means, that regular forces involve circumstances where the president cannot, with the regular military, the active service military, execute the laws of the United States. So, what does that mean? That means the president has a circumstance where the army is called up, but the members of the army that can get to that location expediently is not enough to enforce the laws. So the president, in addition to the army, or perhaps the Navy, or the Marines, calls up a local National Guard unit as well to have the appropriate number of people. That's how at least 5 of the justices read this. There was also a concurring opinion by Justice Brett Kavanaugh, because the majority opinion, or the majority order, I shouldn't be calling it opinion, also touched upon another issue where the federal government, the White House, was arguing, or the executive branch was arguing that, well, wait a second, the president can use the National Guard under Article 2, and in doing so, he's not executing the laws of the United States because he's relying upon the Constitution. And because it really is it really is in conflict with the dissent by Justices Alito and Thomas. What the majority order says is if that interpretation is correct, it's hard to see how performing the functions the White House wants to perform would constitute executing the laws of the United States under the particular statute. So essentially, what the majority said was that, well, if that's the way you're going to read it in this alternative argument, you can't rely on the statute you're relying
Okay.
on.
Okay.
But again, the long and short of it is the White House cannot use the National Guard to assist immigrations and customs enforcement in Chicago. And while this is an order in a pending case, it's not a final opinion. The effect that it has is if the White House were to attempt to activate the National Guard for the same purpose in other states, it would be faced with the same barrier. No, I say that with the president. My understanding is Tim Walz, the governor of Minneapolis, executed the National Guard in Minneapolis. And my
Right.
understanding is what the Guard has been doing there is far different from what ICE has been doing. The Guard is basically, keeping the protesters at a safe distance. I heard from someone that they were offering Mylar blankets and hot chocolate to some of the protesters. Again, far different from pepper spraying people on the other side of the street, which is what we've been seeing on the news. Um, but again, the long and short of it is the a majority of the members of the Supreme Court said you can't do this. I say a majority because there is a lengthy dissent by Justice Alito in which Justice Thomas joins that just I'm still having trouble grasping the mental gymnastics of the dissent. I don't understand how its arguments relate to the order issued by a majority of the court. There is also a dissent by Justice Gorsuch in which he basically says, look, you've engaged in interpreting this statute at this preliminary stage. I think we should hold off on doing that. And if we're going to hold off on doing that, we shouldn't allow the district court to interpret the statute for the purpose of entering an injunction. And my response to that would be, well, if you're really going to engage in, that level of abeyance or
Right.
holding off on doing things, when is an injunction ever going to be appropriate since injunctions are always issued under interpretations of existing laws? So yeah, some unusual opinions on multiple levels. I mentioned there was a concurring opinion by Justice Kavanaugh where he says, I agree that regular forces should only be active military, and I think you should have stopped there. Because again, what the majority order does is it says, well, if the White House's interpretation of enforcing the laws is correct, then you can't rely on this statute. And then Kavanaugh goes into this hypothetical about what if people were storming a courthouse in Philadelphia and you couldn't get active military there? Well, you should be able to activate the National Guard to protect the federal courthouse in Philadelphia. And I would point out that there is a mental fallacy with that hypothetical, and it's one that you touched upon that where when we started, and that is ordinarily the governor activates the National
Right.
Guard. So
Right.
Kavanaugh's premise is a false premise. If you really had people storming a courthouse in Philadelphia, then the governor, Shapiro, could activate the National Guard to keep the peace around the courthouse in Philadelphia. That is not a power that exists exclusively with the President of the United States, even if it is a federal property we're talking about.
Okay. So here's another thing that really, really bothers me about all this. Um, one of the things that I'm thinking about is it's really questionable what ICE is doing and the violence in what ICE is bringing into the communities. We now have two people that have been killed in Minnesota. And just and I think one of the irritating things is thank God we have a news that's going to bring out and investigate what's going on so we'll get the truth, because it seems that the Justice Department only says we did the right thing because he had a gun. He never, there's no indication that he ever used the gun. And not only that, there are lots of questions about the reason that he was shot, the last individual. So I think what is so important about this case is I'm glad that five of the justices said, no, wait a minute, this should be only the military. And from what I can read, and I may be wrong, ICE or Border Patrol are not considered to be a part of this military that they think should take the action. So I'm questioning and saying, well, it sounds like to me that ICE doesn't have near the power that Trump has given them to go in and take people off the street and to do all kinds of things, because it doesn't seem to fit with the Constitution. It doesn't seem to fit with the acts you're talking about or the orders you're talking about. So correct me or let me know where we can go from here, because I think that's another major issue.
Yeah, well, and let me initially point out that Immigrations and Customs Enforcement is not the military. This order is limited to just keeping the National Guard from coming in and joining Immigrations and Customs Enforcement officials in the conduct they've engaged in. And if you will grant me some leeway in about 10 or 15 minutes, I'll get to why I think that might not be the best thing. Um, but since you mentioned it, there are a couple of things that I want to touch on going back to the dissent by Justice Alito. One of the arguments that the dissent relies upon is something called party presentation. They say the court should not have interpreted this statute because neither the state of Illinois nor the executive branch, the White House, was questioning the meaning of exactly what regular forces means. The legal term is party presentation. And what Alito and Thomas said, and their primary argument was really if the parties didn't present this issue to us, then we really shouldn't be taking it up now on our own. And I would say that this is a rather disingenuous argument by these two justices for
Uh-huh.
this reason. Um, in Dobbs, a case we haven't discussed, it wasn't the state of Mississippi that questioned the continuing legality of Roe v. Wade. It was the Supreme Court that asked for additional briefing on it. And with one case that you and I have discussed, the Calais case out of Louisiana, the state
Right,
of Louisiana didn't argue that Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act was unconstitutional because it relies upon race in violation of the Equal Protection Clause and the due process clauses in the 14th and 15th
right,
Amendments. It was the Supreme Court that asked for additional briefing on that issue. So
right.
I really consider that argument by these two justices to be bullshit. Um,
Thank you. I'm glad
that
to hear that
that
because I couldn't even
that
understand
that's
it.
a very particular legal term. I don't know that I need to explain it today,
I don't
though.
think you need to explain it.
The other thing that comes into it, and this is where I'll touch on and return to the point you're raising, it somewhat is Alito and Thomas question the decision of the district court in a very lengthy opinion to question the credibility and disregard declarations that were provided to it by members of Immigration and Customs Enforcement, talking about just how bad things were in Chicago and what was going on there. And from a legal standpoint, the district court is closest to the action. That's the court that sees the witnesses that come before it, even if it hasn't seen them as they give the testimony in their declarations. It will have occasion to see what's going on in the streets in Chicago where that court sits. So legally, the appellate courts will not delve into and will question credibility and will not question credibility determinations by the district court unless they find that the court's decisions were clearly erroneous. And Alito and Thomas, in questioning the district court's decisions to disregard or pay short shrift to some of the Immigration and Customs Enforcement affidavits, really seems to be going against that long-standing legal precedent by saying, wait a second, there was a mountain of evidence about why Immigrations and Customs Enforcement needed that. And to bring that back to what you were talking about with Minneapolis, we have heard with each of these shootings how immediately you have declarations by Homeland Security and the White House about how these people are domestic terrorists. And then when we see the video, or how the customs enforcement officers, ICE officers, were in fear of their lives because the person was brandishing a gun. And then we see clear video from multiple angles where the person was not a domestic terrorist. He was trying to assist a woman in getting up off the sidewalk after she had been pepper sprayed and pushed by ICE officers. And when he was taken down, a member of ICE disarmed him before he was shot multiple times. So I think that what has played out in Minneapolis post this order being issued really brings into effect why it was valid of the district court to question the credibility of these declarations. Earlier this week, Jake Tapper on CNN had a post to, not on CNN, but the guy Bovino, who was recently relieved of his duties in Minneapolis, said that he had never lied. And Tapper, as he put it, had the receipts and brought up multiple incidences where Bovino had lied to the district courts in Chicago when he was there doing some of the same things that have been going on in Minneapolis. So it troubles me that the dissent relies upon the declarations of the ICE officers to say that the majority order got it wrong without regard to the lengthy analysis by the district court explaining why those declarations should not be given, the level of consideration that the dissent clearly tries to give them.
Well,
Now,
wait a
yes,
minute. Let me just say one thing. I read Alito's dissent. Number one, it jumps off everywhere, all over the place. There are multiplicity of cases that he lists and all this. It doesn't make the way it's written. I mean, I've seen court cases many, many times because I thought about instead of being a PhD, I would go to law school. I've seen a lot of cases in my lifetime, and there is no organizational focused or presence in the dissent that gives any credibility to it. And what I think is sad is Thomas and Alito seem to, anytime Trump does anything, they're going to support it, no matter what it is, and then they'll try to build a case with it. I think what I do value is I don't mind Kavanaugh concurring and then giving some more thought to things. But I think there is no substance to what Alito wrote. And I support what you're saying. Now, what is going to be the next step after this? Because I know now Trump is under tremendous pressure by the Republicans in Congress because there's 70, I have read in articles, there's 72% of America that think that ICE has gone way too far. It's totally unacceptable, and that we don't kill our own citizens that are simply trying to have the right to speak their opinion. So I don't know where you want to go with this case, but that's some of the thoughts that I would throw out.
Um, I hope that what we have seen in the past 2 days will be what happens going forward, that cooler heads will prevail. Um, I fear, based upon prior history, that that is not going to be the case.
Right.
Um, this White House, both in its first term and for the first year of its second term, seems to show the insecurities and mental reasoning of an 8-year-old.
Yeah, I agree.
And I think eventually, when people start questioning the strength of this White House, or saying that it's finally acknowledging that it got something wrong, what I fear is going to happen is it will just double down. Um, a lot of the decisions that have taken place the past couple of days, questions about whether Kristi Noem will be impeached, sending Bovino back to Border
Right.
Patrol in Southern California, I think were largely done to quiet Republican senators and members of Congress that were starting to openly express their reservations about what's going on. But at the same time, I anticipate that the reason Bovino and the reason Noem were doing the things that they were doing is because if they were not directly told by the White House that this is what should be done, the implication was that this is what the White House wanted. And what I'm concerned about is the White House tried to massage things and use the National Guard to avoid the effect of Posse Comitatus. And what I'm afraid is going to happen next is something like this will flare up in the next blue state, if you will, a state
Right.
where the governors are not going to openly um, uh, say yes, sir, to the orders coming down from the White House. And my concern is that in the next instance, the president is going to go ahead and use what's referred to as the Insurrection Act. Specifically, there's a statute 10 USC 333, which allows the president, by using militia or armed forces or both, to take measures he considers necessary to suppress in a state any insurrection, domestic violence, unlawful combination, or conspiracy that opposes or obstructs the execution of the laws of the United States or impedes the course of justice under those laws. And what I fear will happen is the White House is going to send active military to the next state under the Insurrection Act, saying that the actions being taken against immigrations and customs enforcement involve domestic violence or some unlawful combination, and that those actions oppose the efforts of immigrations and customs enforcement to execute the laws of the United States in taking possession of illegal immigrants and turning them over to be processed for deportation. And the reason this concerns me is, while we have the greatest military in the world, um, and I will pay heed to multiple people, many of them in the military, but amongst legal scholars, Steve Vladek, who is a professor of law at Georgetown, a former professor at the University of Texas School of Law, has pointed out in one of his writings on One First, which I highly recommend to your listeners, that when people are trained in the military, in the Army or the Navy or the
Right.
Marine, they're trained under what are called rules of engagement. They are not trained and instructed on how to keep the peace and enforce the laws and make arrest. They are trained to view the situation, perceive a threat, and neutralize that threat. And neutralizing that threat as they are trained doesn't mean putting the person in cuffs and arresting them. It means using deadly force quite often. So, quite simply, under the Insurrection Act, the idea is I send active military in to assist immigrations and customs enforcement in enforcing the laws they're supposed to be enforcing. Basically, I make members of the Army additional immigrations and customs enforcement employees. The problem is members of the military, active military, aren't trained the same way that one would expect law enforcement officers to be trained. They're not dealing with, you know, enforcement of the laws. They're dealing with engagement with potentially deadly enemies. Essentially, you're using a sledgehammer where a scalpel is the appropriate tool. And I, I'm going to speculate here, but my understanding is you've had a lot of people signing up to join ICE because of the big bonus checks.
That's
And to get
correct.
those people out on the street in a hurry, ICE has limited the amount of training. And if you meet certain prerequisites, the amount of additional training required is even less. You could be on the street in a couple of weeks. And it wouldn't shock me if what is happening here, we don't know the identities of the ICE officers that shot Mr. Preddy, but what we see in the video is they're on one side of the street and then they cross the street to engage with protesters that are filming them on cell phones, which I don't see as being a violation of any law.
Right. Right.
They're what those individuals did involved rules of engagement, not rules of enforcement. And it wouldn't shock me if what we have former members of the active military who have no idea how to enforce immigration laws that have caused these problems to begin with. But that's just me engaging in rank
Well,
speculation.
no,
I'll point
no, I
that out.
don't think it is. I don't think it's speculation. Because when you and I talked about, and I wrote a great deal about his use of military forces in California, that's exactly what happened. And what I know is the military is trained to deal with individuals or groups that are truly creating a deadly force for the United States. You know, when we look at things that have happened in Iraq or in other countries where we've been at war, it's because we have been threatened in such a way that war was declared. What I think is a concern for me is I don't think that the Constitution or the rule of law have established what Trump is doing as a very highly aggressive, action oriented process of pulling people off the street, never giving them due process, and all those other things. So I do not think any of the ICE actions at this point are legal or under the rule of law. I think, let me just finish one more thing.
Yeah.
I believe, and I don't know if people know this, Obama sent more people and deported more people than any president prior to this. He deported more people than Trump has ever even thought about deporting. And you can look at the records of that. And what I think is sad is We as Americans have to understand that these protests have to continue, and we have to start electing people that will support the rule of law and understand that the actions that Trump's ICE are taking is not supported by any rule of law that we have. Because I know for a fact that during Obama's time, ICE did investigate, did go through the court system, took all the actions necessary to deport a number of people. So I'll back off now on your turn.
Yeah, and Trump v. Illinois doesn't deal with that larger question of the legality of ICE. And I'm sure we will see that at some point. A lot of discussion last week and this week has involved the use of administrative warrants where ICE is going into and entering the residences of people based upon a document signed by another employee within Immigrations and Customs Enforcement and not a federal judge. And I would point out, as a starting point, when that issue gets litigated, that the Fourth Amendment concerning unreasonable searches and seizures reads the right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects. It is not limited to citizens. It applies to people, which would include non-citizens. It would include people the White House chooses to classify as illegal aliens. They are still people. So the breadth of the Fourth Amendment, based upon existing Supreme Court precedent, would suggest to me that yes, some of the things that ICE is doing runs afoul of the Fourth Amendment. Um, and again, getting back to it, my concern is that this is not going to stop until, and even then, I mean, in Chicago, ICE continued to do things after the district court in Chicago was ordering them not to do those things, which is why several members of ICE were called onto the carpet and were the subject of show cause orders by the federal judge in Chicago. And we're seeing similar things happen in Minneapolis right now, where
Right.
the courts are entering orders, and the response of ICE is basically, screw it, we're going to do what we want anyway. And based on what the U.S. Supreme Court has done previously, the problem is we can't have a nationwide injunction to prevent this conduct. Not that ICE has been obeying the injunctions that have been issued to date, because the Supreme Court says the injunctions have to be limited to the parties of that case. They have really hamstrung the ability of
Right.
local courts to do their jobs when you have an executive branch engaging in conduct like this. I will also point this out from a historical perspective. The statutes referred to as the Insurrection Act are 200 years old. Those laws were passed at a time when, as I have read, Congress had far more faith in the executives running our country. In particular, the act was put in place after George Washington was forced to jump through certain hoops that existed at that time to keep the peace in the state of Pennsylvania.
Right.
So the Insurrection Act was an act by Congress at that time to make things better or easier for the president, because at that time the president was the father of our country, and many of the founding fathers that followed him had the faith of not just 37% of the people, but of all of the people.
Right.
And I don't think that the broad language of the Insurrection Act really ever contemplated someone who is acting in the manner that President Trump has acted, at least in his first year in office. I mean, you talked about President Obama and the number of people deported during his 8 years in office. One of the stats that I have read in the paper over the past year is in large part due to the threats being made by the current administration before Trump even took the oath of office a second time, people just stopped coming. The number of people crossing the border illegally is down substantially. So, in that regard, it seems to me that President Trump has fulfilled that promise to his constituents without having to engage in these jackbooted tactics that we're seeing in Chicago, in Minneapolis. Um, but with all of the funding that's been dedicated to ICE, it's like the $1,200 hammer in the 1980s. ICE is finding excuses to spend that money and, to attempt to keep the White House happy. And again, I really have grave concerns about the eventual use of the Insurrection Act. I mean, the statute I read to you allows the president to take measures he considers necessary. It provides a subjective point of view to the president to do what he considers necessary. There's no requirement of a court order. There are no standards set out for what exactly necessary means. It allows President Trump to exercise his subjective point of view in this circumstance. And that's what really frightens me. I mean,
Yeah.
with the Minnesota National Guard in Minneapolis right now, there's a difference between people that are in service one weekend a month and, for a couple of weeks over the summer, as opposed to someone who is living that life currently 24/7, 365 at Fort Hood. I mean, when the National Guard in Minnesota is done, those people are going to find themselves in the same churches and coffee shops and offices with the people that are on the other side of that, rope protesting. So
Right.
they act a little differently in relation to their neighbors. Those people aren't the neighbors of someone from Fort Hood or Fort Benning.
Right. And I think you're making some tremendous statements because I think that's my concern as well. I think it's fascinating that the National Guard in Minnesota are wearing some kind of yellow draping and they don't have their faces covered versus the ICE who are coming in with their mask on and all the other things. So the population in Minnesota knows which is which. The other thing that I would say to you is, as a PhD and having worked in mental health clinics, having worked in for many years for as a therapist before becoming a coach and having been there, and I've been in the mental health business 48 years. So what I know is after Trump's first term, there were a lot of things written about his mental state of mind. And Time magazine said he's not only a narcissist, he's a sociopath. And they built a case about how severely disturbed he was. So I want to do something and say your analysis of an 8-year-old is exactly what a narcissist is. And it's particularly even more serious when you think about not having a conscience like sociopaths do not have a conscience. I'm not talking about psychopaths. Those are the serial killers. I'm talking about sociopaths who have no conscience and they act to feed their own ego. And I believe something, no matter how people view her, and I have not been able to really clearly accept a lot of things she does. But Green has brought out the issue that Trump is losing his megas. And there are articles out about megas that do not support the actions that ICE is taking. And to me, many of the megas are supposed to be, religious and all kinds of things. How can someone justify treating people the way they are? I think that anytime, for an example, I think that the reason, and I want to give you something else. I think the reason that the Texas National Guard was supposed to be called out is because the governor of the state of Texas will do anything that Trump asks. He's made it very clear in his redistricting. I think it's also a real concern of mine because if you keep saying that immigrants are aliens, and Alito had the audacity to use that word in his dissent. Not only that, the White House continues to call people aliens or insurrectionists or any number of things. It's like a programming to try to convince people. Now, when 73 to 75% of the country, that has to include some mega people that are shifting. 73 to 75 do not support this. I think we are, no matter what their redistricting is, I think they're going to see some things as a result of it in the 2026 elections. And I think there is too much. Um, and I'm curious because the Democrats, as well as some Republicans, are now talking about not supporting any more money or the big bill that they have around ICE. Now, they talk about it and then they back up because they're threatened or something else. I've never seen, except in Trump's time, I've never seen any president threaten and have people who will go threaten not only families, but people that are in the Congress. Not only that, we've had congressional representatives and their wives killed. So there is a violence that is there, but we cannot back off from it. We have to continue to have a voice and say, this is not acceptable. It's not a way. Because I think one of the things people do not understand, I have a video that is in one of my previous podcasts that gives a thorough analysis of what Biden did near the end, and he and Kamala Harris did 6 months before the election. They didn't talk about it enough. But that video shows the reason that there was a complete stopping of people trying to come over. So I don't remember the podcast, but I will say that it is a video that I used that gives a clear picture, and it was put out in one of the major magazines as well. And it was put out 2 weeks before the election, and it's tragic because it shows what happens. So I will back up what you're saying. Before ever Trump got in office, there was a stopping of the massive entering of immigrants from other countries.
Well,
So go ahead.
you have touched on issues with sociology and psychology that I'm not going to wade into. I mean, my focus was simply to point out under the Insurrection Act, if I'm peacefully protesting ICE being in my city, you could have the president viewing the use of active military as being necessary to suppress my actions that oppose the execution of the laws of the United States. Is my peaceful protest an opposition to the execution of the laws of the United States?
Right.
Again, I fear that's where we're headed, and I fear, given the breadth of the so-called Insurrection Act, that that's the type of thing we could see going forward. I will do this, though. I will engage in a simple uh, math problem because, as a lawyer, I think I am qualified to do this, even though I can't weigh in on issues that are in your area of expertise, like the psychology and sociology of what's going on. I will point out that my understanding from the most recent census is we've got roughly 250 million people in the United States of voting age that are citizens. And 78 million of them, regardless of the flaws that we may have observed in this man, or let's say there are probably not flaws to those 78 million. Regardless of what we learned about President Trump during his 4 years in office, during his first term, 78 million of us still showed up at the polls and voted for him to have another term as president after Biden served 4 years. So I think the real issue is not only with our president, but is also with understanding why is it 78 million of our neighbors decided to do that, decided to vote for someone who I I fear will use the Insurrection Act before this term is over.
Well,
Um,
and I think you brought up a good point. And what I want to say is I think those 78 million, because I know how much money was spent to create comments that were a lie about Kamala Harris in a Jewish community to say that she wasn't going to support a Jewish community. And there were all kinds of propaganda and lots of money spent on putting out very untruthful kind of things. So I think what we're seeing here, number one, is there are a group of people that are very religious and thought he was the coming, and then after when he lived through the him being shot, they thought that somehow he was the answer. The other part had no knowledge or
if he's
understanding.
the answer, what's the question?
Yeah, and that's what my problem is. We didn't even have a question. Nobody questioned it. The other thing I think is there was a group that have no knowledge about politics, and they heard the propaganda and they heard the drama that he created. And so they then voted for him because they had no knowledge about the issues at hand. Now, one of the things I think is happening is I think I hate to say this on a podcast, but I'll say it anyway. I think this had to happen. I think he had to become president so all those 78 million that voted for him could then see the real person and who he is. And there is a reality. He said that he was going to be much more vicious, much more aggressive in his second term. And the truth of it is, he doesn't have previous Republicans that held him accountable. We see evidence of it. There's Republicans are not holding him accountable because the Congress has become a non-entity. So my answer to all that is, it is time for, that's the reason I do these podcasts, Richard, with you, and then spend all the time researching and writing them as well. I am making every effort to educate people about what is happening. It is then their right to decide what they really want to do and who do they think best to represent them. Now, I think there's a very interesting thing that I'm just going to drop in here that has nothing to do with our case today. But Crockett, who is not suppressing any comments in Texas about Trump, has 43% over 37 in her particular Senate race she's running. I think people are waking up. I don't know what they'll do with what they're seeing, but if 73 to 75% do not support ICE, they are going to do something. They will protest. They will silently vote so nobody knows what is happening. I am concerned And I think there's a great possibility that your prediction is correct because there are too many things happening with the Justice Department and a constant effort to do anything against Democrats or anything against people that he perceives as an enemy. That is in my field. And that's the reason I have mentioned some of the research and some of the things that people have diagnosed him with that we think we see today. And I'll be honest, I'm probably going to do a podcast by myself because I am building behavior patterns to show that he's not just 8 years old. There is a real reason for him taking all these actions because there's something seriously wrong. So let me ask you this. Can you take this case we've talked about and the things that are in your field, and what would you say are the most important things for us as Americans to understand about what is going on with the Supreme Court, with the circuit courts, and with the district courts? That's how I'd like to end today. So please
Uh,
take whatever time.
okay, and let me, moving outside of the substance of the order that we can presume, while no names are on it, the presumption is that Amy Coney Barrett, John Roberts, um, Sotomayor, Kagan, and Jackson were five justices who agreed with the court's order. We also know that Kavanaugh concurred with the first part, that being regular forces means active military. Now, I'll close with this point. Um, there was a case before the end of the year. Again, it was an order, not an opinion. But in regards to some of the seizure searches and detentions that ICE was engaging in, there were questions raised about profiling improperly. And Kavanaugh, in a concurring opinion in that case, and I believe he mentions it or cites it in his concurring opinion in Trump
Yes.
v. Illinois, had said that it's okay for ICE to use factors such as the color of one's skin in deciding to make these stops, you know, without any real probable cause. Now, in footnote 4 of Kavanaugh's concurrence, and hold on, I want to read this language because it really is kind of out of place for this order. But in footnote, let me find it, 4, he says, or it reads, the state and the government disagree about whether the immigration officers have violated the Constitution in making certain immigration stops and arrests. The basic constitutional rules governing that dispute are long-standing and clear. The Fourth Amendment requires that immigration stops must be based on reasonable suspicion of illegal presence. Stops must be brief, arrests must be based on probable cause, and officers must not employ excessive force. Moreover, the officers must not make interior immigration stops or arrests based on race or ethnicity. It seems to me in note 4 of his concurrence, Kavanaugh is backpedaling from what he said in a concurring opinion about the propriety of these ICE stops in late 2025. And it may be that as he's seen more of these cases and more of these issues have been briefed, he's telling us that, okay, at the preliminary stage, I was okay with it. But when we issue a final opinion, I'm not going to be okay with it. Or it could just be that in seeing these things, perhaps he's coming around and changing his point of view. In one of our earlier podcasts, I mentioned to you that he seems to be a bit of a pragmatist. He seems to think of the broader effect of the opinions that the court issues in addition to the law. And where I'm going with that is it seems to me, at least with Trump v. Illinois, you've got six justices that want to put guardrails in place on this
Right.
administration in some circumstances. And perhaps we can look for that going forward and look for the court, not just in these preliminary orders, but in some of the opinions we're waiting on, like whether or not the president can impose tariffs or whether or not that is an improper use of the taxation authority that it belongs to the legislative branch, not the executive branch. In some of those opinions, we may see the court shifting a little amongst what I would characterize as, how would I put it? The non-Thomas and Alito conservatives. That's how I
Right.
would put it. That
Right. And I
perhaps
think,
Kavanaugh is
yeah,
taking a more practical approach in relation to this administration, despite his beliefs in the unitary executive authority. That perhaps Justice Roberts is deciding, okay, I've spent the past 2 decades trying to decide things on rules and procedure and avoiding major substantive issues where I can, but perhaps it's time I start weighing in on some of these major substantive issues. That perhaps we're headed in that direction,
right.
but the truth is, that's just a wild ass guess on my part, Jackalyn.
I know, but I want to tell you something. I think we need to put these guesses out because I do believe the American people are getting tired of this. And I think when we have the percentages that I'm seeing in all the news, in legitimate news, then I think what's going to happen is I think people are seeing him for who he really is. And I think it's going to be important for us to keep looking. And I think a lot of my friends just say, well, we can forget the Supreme Court. See, I know we can't. There is something that we have to realize. Roberts was not appointed by Trump. Roberts is from another appointment. And not only that, Barrett sometimes surprises me in what she does. She's fixated on abortion, but then she comes up with something, and I go, okay, you sound like you have some legal knowledge that can be helpful. I don't know where we're going, but I think you and I are making our very best effort to say, people stop looking at the lack of action in Congress and start paying attention to the court system because that's where we are taking some stands to really truly have a government that has to live with the rule of law. And to me, the rule of law is what is at the foundation of our democracy. So, as
That's as good a point
always,
to end it on as any.
well, and I thank you, Richard, and I'm looking forward to whatever you bring up next because you always come with the right thing. So thank you very much, and we will end this particular